Hello, everybody. Joe Concha filling in for Steve Malzberg once again here in New York. It's the Steve Malzberg Show. Excellent show lined up for you. Glad you're joining us. Neil Munro, he's a White House correspondent for the Daily Caller. He's here to talk about the president's UN speech. Ed Rollins, Fox News senior political analyst, here to talk about ISIS attacks and the Senate still locked up for the GOP. Is that happening? Is it not happening in November? Alex Pappas, talking about the possibility of Senator Jim Webb challenging Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. Martin Lee on medical marijuana. Tom Brogan, the National Review, to talk about if the British will be joining us to defeat ISIS. All that and more. But first, let's go to a clip of President Obama at the UN General Assembly talking about Muslims in a much different light than he did in 2008.
The second, it is time for the world, especially Muslim communities, to explicitly, forcefully, and consistently reject the ideology of organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIL. It is one of the tasks of all great religions to accommodate, devote faith with a modern, multicultural world. No children are born hating, and no children anywhere should be educated to hate other people.
Well, President Obama has had a very interesting week here in New York. First, he launched an airstrike on Syria. Then he made a rather controversial speech at the UN General Assembly that you just saw on Wednesday, when he promised the military would work with allies to dismantle the Islamic State's, quote, network of death, and warned Russia that it would pay for its bullying of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin currently on the phone with Ivan Drago to see if he's around to protect him from such threats. Anyway, he even referenced this summer's police shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, and the resulting chaos that we all saw on our television screens. And then the following day, the president saluted Marines with a coffee cup, apparently there was latte in it, in his hand. And here to talk about all of this and much more is the White House correspondent for the Daily Caller, Neil Munro. Neil, thanks for joining us from Washington.
Delighted.
So let's start with coffee first. We'll go a little bit light. You know, we had a good guest on yesterday, Rick Unger, who brought up the point that President Bush once walked off of Marine One holding a dog and saluting the Marines at the same time. And why should this be any different? Is this really a big deal, or is this just another example of President Obama, at least in conservative circles and what we've been hearing, not having the respect for the military that he should?
Well, voters are busy. They're raising kids and cooking dinners and watching TV, and they take cues on the performance of their leaders by these subtle little measures. And the Democrats know this. In 2012, they tried to make a big issue of how the GOP candidate, Romney, once carried a dog safely in a dog container on top of his car. They wanted to say, oh, look, he does this. He's mean to dogs. He'll be mean to you, voters. No, we look at these things for guidance on what our leaders think of us. And the president, indeed, he got off that helicopter, barely made a salute. And it kind of looks bad, especially when our soldiers are going off to war. And so a lot of people criticized him for his sloppiness because they suspect it reveals the true guy who really isn't doing a good job. So it's not unreasonable to focus on coffee cups.
Neil, I agree with you to this extent that the timing of his optics are always horrible. That after the first beheading of Foley in Iraq, Jim Foley, he goes golfing 15 minutes later after making an announcement around that. And I don't mind, or I don't begrudge the president golfing. I think it's a tough job. There's a lot of stress and tension, and as a golfer myself, a lefty one, that matter, it is good to relieve some stress once in a while. However, you don't go golfing 15 minutes after that announcement. Maybe take the day off in that situation. And the coffee cup is the same thing. And it's funny because, or at least ironic, that the president was elected on optics. Remember the Greek columns in 2008 in Denver during his speech there, and so many things just being choreographed so well. And then just in the impromptu moments, he just doesn't seem to have the instincts in this case. So while I don't think it's the biggest deal, at the same time, it was an unforced error and one that he did not need, particularly at this time when we're launching strikes in Syria and we're calling on our military that there should be some respect being shown. I completely agree with you in that regard. Let's shift gears for a second, Neil. Wanted to talk to you about the article that you wrote, which I read with great interest. And the headline was, Obama criticizes Muslim wars as madness. And this was going back to his speech on Wednesday. That sounded just downright just like George W. Bush, Bush 43, his predecessor. He ran against John McCain in 2008, but let's face it, he was running against all Bush policies, particularly as it pertained to the Iraq War, to the Afghan War to a certain extent. And now he just sounds, if you juxtapose Bush's speeches with Obama's, you literally cannot tell the difference, Neil.
Well, yeah, he's learning. I mean, he spent the first 5 years on the job thinking, well, if we sort of go hand in hand with the moderate Muslims, those are the guys with beards down to halfway down to their chin or down to their throat, then we'll be fine. And then we work with the Muslim moderates to keep the Muslim radicals, Al-Qaeda, away from us. Well, that's his gamble all along. And I think he realized it was a failed gamble. The moderates took over in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, and we basically got more war and more killing. So I think the president is learning that the problem is Islam. And so in this speech, he talked about Islam, people, Muslims, teaching hate and being unable and unwilling to accept other religions. The deal isn't done. The president, however, is still kind of hoping the moderates will help him out. He's still saying ludicrous stuff like Islam is a religion of peace. It isn't. It's a religion of war. But he's learning on the job. You can see he's struggling to get past the preposterousness of his early years. So you could say the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. Being an optimistic kind of guy, I'll say half full.
Neil, one word that stuck out at me in this speech was the use of the word evil. And I remember when George W. Bush used it in his speeches, and he talked about axis of evil, or he talked about the evildoers, and he was mocked by many on the left as being just so simplistic and just so cowboy that there's good guys and bad guys. And evil is just such a hyperbolic term. Yet in its simplicity, it shows that George W. Bush really didn't have any depth, really didn't understand the problem and how to solve anything as it pertains to the Middle East or terrorism. And now I hear President Obama use that word on several occasions yesterday. Again, the irony is just overwhelming, Neil.
Well, that's the way Washington is. A lot of people just pick their opinions of the day according to what the team wants. The Democratic team now has a guy who just used the word evil. Therefore, it must be a good use of the word evil. And so we'll forget about all the other times when we laughed at the Republicans for using evil. And remember, for Democrats, evil is a tricky word. It implies there really is a good and there really is a bad that can't be fixed by a government subsidy or a new jobs program or some academics out of Harvard. So they don't really like that idea. They want everybody to be getting along and working things out as if they're at a Harvard seminar. So again, you can regard that as progress. The president is coming to realize the world is really not like what they told him in Harvard.
Yeah, on-the-job training is a great way to put it. The only problem is that we're nearly 6 years into that training. I remember when I worked at Friendly's as a waiter, and that's an ice cream place here in the States, that they gave me maybe like 3 hours, and I had to jump right out there. So, you know, he at least gets a little bit of a padding here. You know, so this is do you see this as a change of heart? In other words, does the president deep down inside now get that radical Islam is evil, is the biggest threat to our freedom right now? Or because he's announced these airstrikes and announced this offensive against ISIS and has taken a different posture, it's just more of a political calculation to show that, well, you know what, they're calling me the weakest president since Carter, and I got to get tougher, I got to sound tougher. I know I'm going to sound like Bush, but I think in the short term this will do me some good.
It's an excellent point. Even when they say the true and correct things, it's only temporary. It's only a coincidence. They'll shift back to whatever suits them the next day. And so I don't think the president takes this whole thing seriously in the sense, I think it's all subordinated to his domestic political incentives and requirements. And so they'll happily go along with the word evil and they'll criticize Islam when it suits them. But in a couple of months, they'll switch it back because one of the primary drivers in the Democratic Party is they really don't want religion to play an important role in politics, especially Christianity. And so they're happy to make deals with Islam and pretend Islam is just like Christianity so that they can sideline it as a mere faith tradition. So I don't think the president is really sincere. I don't think the Democrats will change their underlying self-interested ideology on this. Too bad. And the fault, by the way, lies in ours. We elected him. we should have recognized the nature of his beliefs.
Neil, speaking of change, you just used the word. Eric Holder will be apparently resigning. We should get that announcement in about 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Just curious, in about 30 seconds, can you sum up the legacy of Eric Holder and who do you think is going to replace him?
The most partisan hack who ever occupied the job. He turned that Justice Department into a vehicle for partisan progressive advantage at every turn. He went after GOP politicians. He helped progressive allies. History will look back, with any luck, history will look back and consider him one of the worst attorney generals we ever had.
And who do you any ideas, or what are you hearing down there in D.C. as far as a possible replacement? I've heard Patrick Deval, Massachusetts governor.
Could pick a responsible, safe pick to get him through for the last 2 years, or else he could pick an incendiary, provocative pick, perhaps a Latino or an African American, in order to spark a ethnic fight just before an election so his supporters are more likely to turn out. We'll find the answer to that very quickly.
Well, certainly Eric Holder, one of the most controversial, if not the most controversial attorney general we've ever had. Neil Munro, thank you so much for joining us from D.C. We appreciate it. Joe Concha filling in for Steve Malzberg. And up next, it is the Malzberg panel here on the Steve Malzberg Show. Happy to be filling in today on this Thursday afternoon. Joe Concha at Twitter, at Joe Concha TV. Back with more in just a couple of minutes.